Thank everyone for coming. My name is Zach Knudsen, for those of you who don't know, student coordinator for Ethics at Noon. Today we're lucky enough to have Matt Rothe come and talk to us. He grew up, I guess, out on a farm in eastern Colorado, worked for Nyman Ranch, and then went to Stanford GSB and is now Dining Sustainability Programs Coordinator. And is here to talk about it. Is here to talk to us about not necessarily the ethical implications of like your food of your food choices for the actual animals, but for people. So yeah, thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation. In the last year, we've endeavored on a project to better understand the impacts of our food choices, our food purchases at Stanford Dining. And in context, we serve about 12,000 meals every day, so we're a large organization buying a lot of food, so the decisions we make on a day-to-day basis matter. And what we've discovered in this process of trying to better understand the implications of our food purchases is that we knew that there were environmental implications and externalities being created in the food system, but we didn't realize the extent to which the food system has become morally bankrupt, in my opinion. The reality is there are some hidden issues that most people are not familiar with or aware of, and they are really deeply seated ethical issues with respect to how the food system is treating people, the people that provide us our food, essentially. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the background, sort of the arc of why we got into this work. I'll explain some of the things that we've discovered in this process. And then we'll talk at the end about what we're going to do to create some change based on what we've learned. So the history of the Sustainable Food Program is that in 2006, a small group of students put together a proposal to create my position. And so they went to the provost to get funding. They came to the management of Stanford Dining and said, we'd really like to have this position on campus. The provost agreed to fund it. Our organization agreed to manage it for 2 years. And then at the end of those 2 years, our organization decided to internalize the position by way of a full-time paid position within Stanford Dining. Now, the importance of that is that these students, the reason that they were championing for this position to be created is that they felt like they really needed, that Stanford really needed somebody thinking about and evaluating all of the food that our organization purchases. And again, to the extent that we serve 12,000 meals every single day, our impact and the decisions that we make have a real, can have a real impact. So in addition to education and facilitating research, a lot of what I do is evaluating the food that we buy. So this is what we're going to talk about today. When I came into this position, we didn't really have a framework for doing this, and this isn't novel necessarily, but the way that we're thinking about our food purchases are really in these 4 terms, and they're perhaps obvious, but I'll go through them in a little brevity. One is obviously the environment, so how are our food purchases affecting the various ecological systems on which our food supply depends. The second one is this concept of social equity. It can be a nebulous term for people, and I think you'll understand it a little bit more as I talk more about it, but that's one of the ways that we think about how our food purchases are impacting the systems. Economics is obviously one. And then the fourth is animal welfare. So it's how our food choices with respect to meat, meat byproducts, dairy byproducts, how were those animals treated in the course of their lives and through the end of their lives. So the process for doing this, we do it once a year. It's not very sophisticated because we don't have very intelligent IT systems. But essentially what we do is we ask each of our vendors and suppliers, of whom there are probably 50 or 60, to provide us a list of every single item that we've purchased in the year prior. Now for context, we buy about 15,000 individual unique items that are purchased across 12 different operating units. So the amount of data that we're trying to manage here is almost insurmountable. But at the end of the day, we take all of that information. I hire a small team of students who over the summer take all this information, put it into Excel, manipulate it, and at the end of the day, they provide me a report card on quote-unquote how sustainable our purchases were in the previous year. And then we use this information to set goals as an organization. to benchmark and to hopefully, where I'm moving the organization to is creating accountability for the individual decisions that the decision makers in our organization are making. So a little bit about claims and certification. So this request we send out to our suppliers and our vendors, what we ask of them is for every item that we purchased to indicate whether that item has certain attributes. And these are related to the sustainability of that item. And then they come back and say it was this or was not that, et cetera, et cetera. And the differences between claims and certifications are that claims are just that. They're claims made by the manufacturer, by the grower, by the producer, by the farmer, by whomever in the supply chain is providing us this food. Generally speaking, there's a common understanding of what they mean. The marketplace understands it. It's fairly easy to identify and to ask suppliers to get us this type of food. On the other hand, there are certifications. Certifications are essentially claims that are certified by an independent third body standard or process. Again, they're ubiquitous in the marketplace. I can ask any one of our suppliers for this type of food and they get it to us. Yes, sir?
Can you give an example of what you mean by a claim?
Yeah, actually, we'll get to it in 2 seconds. Okay. So I'm going to talk about these claims and claims and certifications, and we're going to go through them individually. And we're going to start with all of those in the marketplace that relate to the impact to the environment of the food choice. Okay. So I'm going to ask everybody to raise your hand if you're familiar with these terms or if you've purchased some food item that meets these criteria or certifications. Okay. And there's a point to this that you'll see at the end of it. So organic. Anybody have organic? Yes. Okay. Full room. So this is can actually be both a certification. USDA certifies items as organic, or it can be a claim that's made by a small producer who maybe can't afford necessarily the certification process. Grass-fed. Anybody familiar with the term grass-fed? Yep. What about pasture-raised? Okay.
Those are all ambiguous.
These are claims, right? No
When they were
certification.
grass-fed, not the last 3 months. And when it was open range, they say chickens that are raised in coops, when they're born, when they're offered open range, don't do it because they're not in the
Don't
animal.
Yeah. Yeah. I have chickens and they have experienced the same thing. I mean, they have space, but yeah. Who's sort of integrated pest management? You. Okay. What about no antibiotics and or no hormones? Okay. What about natural? Yeah, right? Whatever that means. Free range. Yeah, okay. Anybody here at the Seafood Watch? Green, red, and yellow? Yep, okay. Anybody here at the Marine Stewardship Council? MSC certification? Okay, yeah, not many. All right, interesting. Anybody here this term? Yeah. Believe it or not, this is a term in the marketplace. I think it...
Is that totally artificial?
Yeah, exactly. I looked at this one the other day. Anybody here this one? Protected Harvest Certified? This was entirely new to me, not a single person. I expected that. What about Salmon Safe? Yeah, okay. So just summarizing a little bit. So those are all the terms in the marketplace, claims and certifications that we can use to evaluate the environmental impact of the individual food items that we're buying, right? So now I'm going to talk about the claims, attributes, and certifications with respect to animal welfare. We're going to do the same thing. I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if you've heard of these terms. Cage-free. Yep. Right. Certified humane. Okay. Wow, okay. Animal welfare approved. Okay, I expected that. Anybody here at the Humane Society? What about PETA? Yeah, okay. All right, so those are all the terms, the claims, the attributes that are available again in the marketplace. I can ask for that type of food, and it's easy to get, right? It may not be cheap, but or affordable, but it's easy to get. Now we're going to talk about the certifications and claims and attributes with respect to social equity. And I'm going to ask you to do the same thing, and here hopefully the point will be made. Anybody here at the Food Alliance? We got one. Anybody here at the Agricultural Justice Project who does an AJP certification? No. Okay. Anybody familiar with the Domestic Fair Trade Association? Okay. All right. Okay. Anybody here of this organization called the Coalition of Immokalee Workers? We got one. Okay. What about the United Farm Workers, UFW? Yeah, right. The local organization been around. Cesar Chavez. I would expect more people to know about that. How many people are familiar with the term local? Right? Okay. So here's the point that I'm making here, is that as an organization that serves 12,000 meals every single day, I have an easier time buying food, buying meat products that were from animals that were humanely treated than I do in buying food that was grown using labor that was humanely treated. People. I cannot find it. There are these standards that exist, but they just do not exist in the marketplace, and consumers are unaware of them. And so what's happened is that, I don't know if it's necessarily because these standards are not ubiquitous, but we've allowed ourselves, in my opinion, to use local, this concept of purchasing locally, as a proxy, essentially, for how socially equitable a food purchase is. Okay, and I'm going to explain to you why this is a bit challenging. But first we'll go over the argument for why generally speaking, people in the sustainable food world use local as a proxy for social equity creation. And so the first argument is that there's this concept of local equity, right? We spend our dollars, and by the way, just to qualify local food, I think when people think of local food, they think of an independent and probably small business, right? As compared to a globally traded enterprise who might be down the street. That people don't necessarily think of those large businesses as necessarily being local, right? So with that qualification, the idea is that by spending our money with these organizations, these businesses that are locally owned, that money tends to stay in the community, and it has the effect of raising the overall tide of social welfare. It raises the tax base. It leads to private spending on things like youth league soccer teams, right? I think, and there's been peer-reviewed evidence to suggest that's the case. But we'll get into some examples of why it tends to fall apart. And then the second piece, and this is not as commonly talked about when people think about local food, but there's this idea that equity or wealth is distributed more equitably among the people that work in these businesses, right? So I got to thinking about this, and granted, I get paid to think about this. And I'm not an economist, but it occurred to me that there are some really serious flaws with using this concept of local food in place of other metrics for how socially sustainable our food is. And I'm going to walk through just a couple flaws that I've identified in this logic. And the first flaw is this idea of marginal utility, right? What's the value of of an additional dollar to me versus the value of an additional dollar to somebody else? Okay, and I'm going to use some specific examples of food that we are currently buying at Stanford Dining to illustrate the point here, okay? So we buy rice from the Lumberg family farms. Is anybody familiar with Lumberg? Yep. Great company, locally owned, independently owned. They're not necessarily small, but they're doing everything right with respect to how they're growing their rice in the Central Valley. They're certified organic, they're non-GMO. I mean, they're doing all of these really wonderful things. As far as I understand, I think that they actually invest a lot of money in social programs and in their local communities. So they're doing everything well. We're buying rice from them today. Probably you have not heard of rural returns. Anybody? Maybe you've seen it in the dining halls if you're on the meal plan. But currently we're buying heirloom red rice from Rural Returns. It's an organic product. Rural Returns is essentially a cooperative of small family farmers in Sri Lanka, okay? And to the extent that rice, even organic rice, is a commodity, and thus the price is basically the same. The question that I asked myself and was not able to get a great answer to is, as an organization, we buy, say, $100 in rice every single year, right? And let's say we have the opportunity to buy $100, same quantity, same quality of rice from from the Lumberg family, or $100 of rice from these small family farmers in Sri Lanka who are earning $2 a day. So the question is, which of those dollars is creating the greatest marginal return of equity, right? And the answer is not necessarily, I mean, to me the answer is pretty clear. But the argument tends to fall down. Now the second flaw that I've identified or that I think about in terms of using local as this proxy for sustainable, socially sustainable food is this concept that trickle-down economics works. And I think if anything in the last 30 years we've proven that this does not work. And we've got a bunch of people called Occupy Wall Street now who are basically saying, you know what, this does not work. But here's the example, right? So I go to the California Avenue Farmers Market every Sunday. I buy most of my stuff there. And the Lucero Organic Farm is a vendor that's there most weeks, right? And the question in my mind is, you know, again, I have a certain amount of money I'm going to spend on tomatoes. I can either spend them with Lucero, or I can spend them, say, with Del Monte, right? The conventional thinking about buying local food is that because somehow I'm buying this food grown by Lucero, that money I'm spending with him is being more equitably distributed among the workers and the people that are helping him pick his fruit and get it to the marketplace, as compared to the workers that might be working for a large corporation like Del Monte, right? That's the argument. Now, part of the challenge in that, and I would argue, is that we just don't know. Without some certification, we simply don't know that that's necessarily the case, right? But you could make an argument, and I think a lot of people are starting to make this argument, that to the extent that Del Monte is this really large enterprise, and to the extent that the nonprofit world is essentially monitoring these issues, the nonprofit world is going to invest their time in looking at places like Del Monte, because they get a greater return, right, in that work, because there's a much greater marketplace. They're not going to necessarily spend their time looking at Lucero Organic Farms. So there's a challenge there potentially to this argument, right? And moreover, Lucero is at a serious competitive disadvantage to the Del Montes of the world, right? They don't have the same access to capital, and they certainly don't have the same economies of scale. So anyway, you know, it's not a perfect argument. I mean, we can debate whether local, you know, what I've said here is right or not, but at the end of the day, in the absence of a third-party standard or some other generally or commonly used metric for understanding the social sustainability of our food system, of our food purchases, we just don't have a great metric, and local is not it. So, knowing this, in the last year, I hired an intern, Jenny Balasubramanian. Anybody know her? Yeah, she's been incredible. But she's done essentially a literature review of these issues around social equity creation and destruction and distribution. We've talked to a number of different nonprofits and NGOs who are working in this space, doing interviews, trying to understand all the issues and what's going on. I've read several books, Food Justice, Fair Food. Anybody read those? Tomato Land coming out recently. I would recommend you read them. They'll really open up your eyes. And I'm going to start talking now about some of the issues that we've discovered in this process of researching all of the issues around the social side of our food system. And just one note before we start going there, is that they're fair and just are commonly used sort of interchangeably in this context. There are, in my opinion, two bodies of issues around fair and just food that are emerging. I think one is around the production of food. So this is the labor of the farm workers, the migrants. And then on the other side is the consumption and the access. So this is low-income communities having access to corner stores, basically, instead of grocery stores. So I'm going to play a video. I think that this does a really good job explaining in the voice of the people who have been exploited the issues that they face. Hopefully the audio will work.
I'm a filmmaker and photojournalist who spent the past 15 years of his career documenting child labor and slavery around the world. Among my recent projects are Stolen Childhoods, the first feature-length documentary on global child labor, The Dark Side of Chocolate, an investigation into child trafficking and slavery in Western Africa, which is where 70% of the chocolate we eat comes from. And Fields of Peril, the 2010 report on child labor in U.S. agriculture for Human Rights Watch. And it's this problem that I'm going to talk about today. That because of a double standard in U.S. federal law, hundreds of thousands of American children who pick the food that we eat are denied the same protections that every other child in America enjoys today. They can work at far younger ages, for longer hours at exploitative wages, and at greater risk to their health. Federal laws permit a child age 12 to work at 100-degree heat for 16 hours a day in a tomato field, but may not permit that child to work in an air-conditioned office. In our own country, we have legalized an early end to childhood that we do not tolerate in others. Nelson Mandela said, "There can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way in which it treats its children." What I've known now for nearly a decade is that where children in American agriculture are concerned, the soul of America is languishing. I first became aware of this problem in 2002 while making Stolen Childhood. Among the many abuses I documented around the world were children making bricks in India, children picking coffee on plantations in Kenya, children weaving carpets in Pakistan. After having traveled around the world documenting the worst forms of child labor, you might imagine how stunned I was to find out that it was going on here in our own backyard. American children picking strawberries in Michigan, American children hoeing acres of sugar beet in Minnesota, American children pulling and cutting onions in Texas. The realization that the same conditions that drove 246 million children around the world into the worst forms of child labor also drove hundreds of thousands of American children into a similar life filled me with anger and with questions. How could it be illegal in all those other countries and not be illegal here? How could these children and their families not have the right to a minimum wage, not have the right to overtime, not have the right to a day off? I thought we were better than that. Clearly something had to be done, and since I'm a filmmaker, I made a film. The Harvest La Cosecha chronicles the lives of 3 migrant children and their families over the course of various harvest seasons, where the combined evils of poverty, hazardous conditions, and a lack of educational opportunity robbed them of their future. This is Zulema Lopez. She was turning 12 when I first met her. She is the 3rd generation of migrant farm worker in her family, and she told me that her earliest childhood memories were of her mother teaching her how to pick and clean strawberries. She'd been to 8 schools in 8 years and was afraid that she might not make it to high school. But what really broke my heart was when I asked her what her dreams were, and her response to me was, she didn't have time for dreams. Here, in her own words, is a little of what Zulema's life is like.
And to me, so we pick onions. We get on a car like at 5 in the morning and work all the way to like, I don't know, 5 p.m. We have to get these big scissors, and one time I actually like cut myself by accident, and I had to put like sand on it so the bleeding would stop. We need the money, so I'm just like, Mom, I can go help you, and then she's like, okay. I make like $64 a week, so I think I'm helping her with that.
Even with everyone working, the average farm worker family makes less than $17,500 a year. That's well below the poverty line. These children have no choice but to work. This is Victor Wapila, another of the kids in the film. He's a sweet, gentle and hard-working 16-year-old living in Florida. He's taking a break here from the 1,500 pounds of tomatoes that he picks and carries each day. He told me he wouldn't leave the fields unless his parents came with him. Now, his family migrated here legally looking for a better life. But what they found was that the harvests are always uncertain and the exposure to pesticides a constant danger.
Cuando estábamos poniendo plástico, yo nunca había hecho eso en mi vida hasta apenas, pues vi que no es difícil, pero es muy tóxico, pues. Como yo hace poco pues, estaba trabajando así y pues la piel se me porque le echan tantos químicos y le ponen gas, abono y pues ya cuando iba así por el medio sentía como que me iba a caer ahí en medio de fil de tanto que no podía respirar.
Pesticide exposure levels in the United States are set for the body of a grown man. They don't take into account the developing body of a child. Now, 90% of migrant children don't have a health plan, and 20% of all farm worker fatalities are children. And this is Perla Sanchez, 14, seen here posing with her father. Perla watched her brother die in a hospital waiting room because the family lacked health insurance. And she worries that constantly migrating will keep her from achieving her dreams. She, like so many other migrant children, leaves home before the school year ends and travels state to state to state following the harvest, not returning until weeks or months after school resumes in the fall. As you'll hear, it takes a toll.
Not being able to finish the school year, it's sad. I mean, it is sad. You see all your friends are all happy, they're gonna graduate from 8th grade, they're together, they're gonna have this prom and all this stuff. All this good stuff, all this neat stuff that they get to do at the end of the year, but you can't do it because you're a migrant. And because you're a migrant, you have to go work. Time doesn't stop because you're doing this. Time doesn't stop because you're migrating. Time goes, and as it goes faster. Grades keep going, you fail, you pass, you pass. I have a dream. I have a dream to become a lawyer. I have a dream to help other people stop being migrants. I have so many dreams to help other people just like me.
But no matter what Perla dreams, the facts are that children who switch schools score 20 points lower on standardized tests, and migrant farm worker children drop out at 4 times the national rate. Now, despite the unfair circumstances they've been given, these children are still just children. And like Perla, many of them have dreams. Some may want to be doctors, some engineers, some police officers. None of them want to remain in the fields. It's our responsibility to make sure that they have equal rights under the law so that they can follow those dreams, so that they can follow the American dream. I wanted the Harvest La Cosecha to make people aware of what went on at the ground level here in this country, literally, so that we could begin to define a policy that was fair, healthy, and humane. A policy that uplifted our children rather than grinding them under the heels of profit. If what you see moves you to speak up for these children, you can. You can support the CARE bill that gets rid of these double standards, and you can support current efforts by the Department of Labor to increase safety standards for these children. I'm going to end this talk this morning by honoring a promise I made to Maria Mojica. Maria Mojica was the mother of Chuy Mojica, a 12-year-old I interviewed while making the harvest. My promise to her was very simple, that I would let people like you hear her story. And so this morning, I'm going to honor that promise, and I'm going to let Maria Mojica have the last word.
Cáncer en la sangre debido a tantas químicas que
en los que yo me he expuesto a los trabajos desde niña, lo que dice el doctor, que es por eso ellos consideran que es una razón, una de las razones. ¿Y qué tengo de eso? ¿Qué herencia tengo? Que digan, me quedó una herencia para mis hijos de andar desde niña en el trabajo, es decir, ¿cuál herencia tengo? Por eso a ellos les digo que mi mejor herencia es que estudien, que ellos no anden como yo ando, como ando hasta ahorita. Ah, sí, como cualquier mamá pienso que le gustaría ver a sus hijos realizados, pero me gustaría que ellos se realizaran, se graduaran en lo que están enfocándose al estudiar. Ya para ellos y que ojalá que los demás ayuden y se aprovechen a estar juntos. Es mi ilusión.
So, apologize, that was not terribly uplifting. But in the last year of this work, we've discovered a number of these issues, right? I mean, this is just one of many that we've discovered in the food system. These are not isolated instances. These are common. And the reality is, I mean, the basic conclusion of this work that we've done is that farm workers, by definition of the law, and certainly by our societal norms, are an excluded class of people. We've allowed the country to legislate these people into exclusion. So I'm going to work through some other issues that we've identified. I'm going to actually read them verbatim because I didn't have time to commit this to memory. Most of this was taken from the Inventory of Farm Worker Issues and Protections in the United States, which was originally published by the BAMCO Foundation and the United Farm Workers. So here we go, and bear with me again, I'm just going to read through this. So, lack of wage and hour standards. It turns out that farm workers are exempt from most minimum wage and hour guarantees found in the Federal Fair Labor Standards Act. This is an act that governs everybody else, including everyone in this room who's going to go on and work, or is working today. Right? They are exempt from that. Farm workers are not entitled to overtime pay or mandatory breaks for rest or meals, and small farms have even further exemptions. So this gets to the point I was making earlier about small farms. I mean, legally they're further exempt. 1/4 of all farm workers have family incomes below the federal poverty line. All right, so the next issue. We're aware of this. This is the new labor protection for children. Lack of transparency by farm labor contractors. And so farm labor contractors essentially act as intermediaries between the farmers and the laborers. For example, in California, fully 50% to 75% of all farm workers are employed through a farm labor contractor. And the challenge with these entities is that they essentially remove accountability from the farmer, and that the farmer can claim ignorance with respect to the practices of the farm labor contractor and his or her associations with the people that they're employing. And it does require a license in theory to become a farm labor contractor, but the reality is that the majority of farm labor contractors operating in the United States are operating illegally. Substandard housing and unsafe transportation. So even though the USDA, through one of its programs, regulates housing and transportation for the small minority of employers who provide these amenities to farm workers, these regulations are rarely monitored or enforced, and the living conditions in these housing conditions are terrible, and transportation is fraught with unsafety. Next issue, exclusion from unemployment insurance. So, although unemployment insurance is mandated and funded through the Social Security Act, again, this is a federal act that all of us are protected by. The agricultural sector is governed by special state regulations, which in many cases exempt small farms from providing basic unemployment insurance for their workers. And I think the figures are less than half of all farm workers, and only about 1/4 of these contracted farm workers actually have unemployment insurance. Next issue, the prevention of collective bargaining. This is basically forming a union. Agricultural workers are explicitly excluded from the protections of the National Labor Relations Act. Again, here's a national act that all of us, except for farm workers, are protected by. This act gives most employees the right to engage in concerted activities for the purpose of mutual aid and protection, again, to basically organize. Consequently, under federal law, a farm worker may be fired for joining a labor union, and farm labor unions have no legal recourse to compel a company or agricultural employer to negotiate employment terms. Lack of workers' compensation protections, another issue. So it turns out that most states do not require agricultural employers to provide workers' compensation coverage for migrant and seasonal workers, despite the fact that these are people who are getting injured at a much higher rate than the rest of us. In 2009, the occupational fatality rate for farm workers was 5 times the rate of the average worker in the United States. Loopholes for occupational safety and health standards. Basically, the issue here is that for small family farms, they're not governed by OSHA in any material way. And where they are, it's not monitored or enforced. The act, which means 88% of all farms in the United States are not inspected for basic safety and health. Heat stress. With the exception of California, Oregon, and Washington, agricultural employers are not required to take such basic preventative measures as providing adequate shade and providing employees with rest breaks. Pesticide exposure, which we heard about in the video, often goes unreported and undetected. And then the last one, forced labor. And what we're essentially talking about here is slavery, right? This is the term that is used. I'm not sure why. But listen to this carefully. So farm workers are frequently vulnerable to abuse, especially when they have exclusive contracts with their employers, or when they can be coerced through the threat of deportation, which may be obvious. Forced labor is largely a hidden crime because victims are reluctant or unable through the law to seek help through the official mechanisms. The largest case of slavery, forced labor, in the United States was uncovered in 2010. I'm going to read that again. The largest case of forced labor, slavery, in the United States was uncovered in 2010. This is last year. This case involved more than 400 Thai farmers who apparently were brought into the country to work in farms and orchards, I think, along the West Coast. And I'm going to read you one more here. This is from the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. They do a lot of work in Florida around the tomatoes, production of tomatoes. Quote, federal civil rights officials have successfully prosecuted 7 slavery operations involving over 1,000 workers in Florida's fields since 1997. So, who knew? Did anybody know all this? I mean, this was...
Why can't the farm contractors, the intermediate guys, the people who are responsible for monitoring them, be sued for incompetence and not doing their work?
I think they
Bring
can.
the suit.
Yeah, no, I think they can, and I think a lot of these cases actually that I talked about were brought by way of doing exactly that. But I think there's a legal precedent set for it.
But they're not doing it.
No, they're not doing it.
So they should, you could sue them, couldn't you?
I don't know. Do you know an attorney? Let's do it. Do you know an attorney? Let's go for it.
The law school over here
Yeah.
professes to be like we are.
Yeah, yeah. But there are a lot of people working on this for sure. But that being said, what we can do about it as an organization, Stanford Dining, that serves 12,000 meals every day, buys a lot of food. Here's what we're doing. Given everything we've learned in the last year, we formed a collaborative group of people that are comprised of these various groups. The Real Food Challenge, it's a national nonprofit organization that organizes students on campuses across the country. We're working with them. We're working with NGOs and nonprofits who are working specifically in this space. We've started talking with our supply chain partners. These are the people that we're doing business with today who are bringing food to us, about their thoughts on these issues and how they might play a role in making a difference and changing the way that this works. And then we're also seeking some relationships with philanthropists who are working to make an impact in this space. The objective of this work is pretty simple. I mean, our goal really is to define what fair food looks like, or just food for that matter. And whether that's existing standards and definitions or some combination of these groups that are working on it is yet to be determined. But once we have a common definition, our goal will be to identify it. And this is where our supply chain partners come in, right? Help us find where this food is located. And then through our budget and through some combination of hopefully some philanthropic money, our goal is to essentially create a market for this. To the extent that we can define it, identify it, and start preferentially purchasing it, that is our goal. At the end of the day, what we're trying to do, the big objective of all of this work, is that we want to elevate this concept of fair food in the American lexicon, the consumer's vocabularies, in supply chain, so that it is as ubiquitously known and understood and accessible as things like organic, and we can strike local from our lexicon forever as a means for purchasing socially sustainable. Thanks.